What's up, guys? Today we're going to be talking about a book, but it seems like just not any book. It seems like the book. This one has been read and reviewed to death here on YouTube and all over online. It's got a lot of hype behind it. It's got a lot of praise behind it. Of course, you know what book I'm talking about. It's The Poppy War. Now, I want to give a little bit of, just context of why I read and want to review the book is because, guys, I wasn't planning on reading this book. Honestly, a lot of the hype is what pushed me away from wanting to read the book, but whatever. There's several guys out there that I know have read the book, and I respect their opinions, and that's what made it seem pretty interesting to me. But the nail in the coffin here was when I read a review. I'm not going to say whose it was, but when they claimed that The Poppy War was a better grimdark book than Beyond Redemption, well, that was like the gauntlet thrown down. This was a challenge. Not really a challenge, but I took it as a challenge, and I accepted. And I did an emergency e-read of The Poppy War. The story is about a nation that's been torn by war, where we follow an orphan named Rin. And now Rin is growing up, and she's working in this shop for her foster parents, who are not exactly good people. And she recently has just kind of found out that she's been essentially auctioned off as a wife to somebody else. Now, this whole marriage kind of is set up because it's going to benefit the foster parents. But Rin hates this idea, absolutely doesn't want to just be somebody's wife. And so she ends up studying to take this test so she can kind of try to earn a scholarship into this specific academy. So this is where we get into Rin, and she does this crazy amount of studying. This is also where we start to see like some very addictive behavior in Rin. Now, I'm not saying addictive as in like drugs, but she certainly approaches her studying the same way addicts approach, getting high. So, yes. So anyway, so then Rin tests out like top of the class. She's got awesome scores. She ends up in Synagard, which is like this elite war strategy academy. And what plays out from here is very much the going to the academy trope. Though I will say it's not like done in an annoying way. It all unfolds like in a fun, engaging way. That was one thing I was really blown away with this story, was how much I was engaged in this story and how she was able to string me along in like a really, really nice pace. At the academy, Rin will meet both foe and friend as she, butts heads with classmates as well as teachers. But there will be a certain teacher that takes interest in Rin. Now, this is also where we begin to see a little, snippets of the magic system kind of start to poke their heads up, as well as, we get to do a good chunk of like history and world building here at the academy as well, because it's, it's a war strategy kind of school. So we kind of go over like strategies that worked or didn't work in the past, because this is, like I said, a very war-torn country, and this is also where we get a lot of information about the enemy country. The next part of this story deals with that enemy and the invasion, and this is certainly where I noticed a tonal shift, at least the first of two that I saw in this book, because certainly the first part of this book feels a little YA. There are some dark things happening. You have addiction. There's that, self-sterilization scene. There is lots of dark stuff in that beginning part, but a lot of it is just kind of touched or implied. And I just feel like once we get the invasion, you notice that this kind of stops being like a kid's story, and it starts to become something a little more adult. And this was great for me. This was a really nice, the pace just hit perfect, and it didn't feel jarring like I just left a kiddie story and jumped into an adult tale. It just kind of seamlessly like strung together, and then also it was great for this tonal shift to not be jarring, is what I'm trying to get at, I guess. After the invasion is certainly where this thing really starts to pick up, and we also get introduced to bigger elements of this world and the magic system. Like, the magic system is certainly something that we come to understand the further we get throughout the book, but by this point we're getting a good idea of it. We know that there are gods like to play here, and that they're unruly and maybe just not nice and don't give a shit about us, as well as there's a really cool aspect, like there's some sprinkling of Asian like folklore in here, monsters, which I thought was so well done. There's a specific scene in here done where I just felt like the tension, she did such an amazing job at building this tension, and it all just paid off for that scene. It was really easy to envision and enjoy, so that was big old thumbs up. From here we see Ren join up with the Psyche, who is basically they're the island of misfit toys. They are the ragtag soldiers here that have kind of been deemed too dangerous, and so they kind of have their own little group, which is commanded by somebody that Ren knows, and now their connections will just kind of continue to grow, and they have a lot. You'll just find that they have a lot in common. This is also where it starts to get a little bit darker, but I wouldn't say this is where we see the complete, like, that next tonal shift. But this is where we'll see Ren, and she's faced with the enemy. They look like her. It's not so easy. War is something maybe that's easier talked about in classrooms than it is fighting on the field. Where this story really starts to shift again for me, like, in my opinion, and I think most people will agree with me, it's at that part 2 where the action is finally starting to get a little bit more graphic. Some of the concepts and themes and stuff that are at play are beginning to get a little bit more adult and dark. The commander character certainly begins to seem like he's going down a darker path, as well as just the warfare takes a turn for the more sinister, with the introduction to gas. When I saw that in here, that actually hit me, because I was like, fuck, that is brutal. That is just, like I said, it's sinister. Then we'll hit a chapter where it just definitely feels like, where Kuang just uncorked on everybody, and you'll know if you read the book exactly what chapter I'm talking about, because, and this is also where I could see where people might consider this book grimdark for what this chapter contains, because it is some of the darkest, most disturbing, brutal, it's just bad. I mean, it covers everything from graphic violence and dead bodies and dead babies and rape and just the worst kinds of stuff that can come out of war and the like, is in this chapter. And it's not like she didn't pull any punches. It is unforgiving in its delivery, and you certainly will feel it. And what plays out here through the rest of the story really is like we just watch Ren kind of progressively make worse decisions, but like I said, you're dealing with a young character who has been traumatized. She's an orphan, so she's probably been traumatized since birth, and now you're introducing a war that she's slammed into, as well as just some ties between her and her commander. There's a lot of things at play here that I can understand where maybe somebody wouldn't be making the smartest choices. All right, so I really just want to get into the stuff, man, right? Let's talk about the things I really liked here and the things maybe I didn't. Honestly, like I said, I didn't want to read this book in the first place. Okay? I'm glad I did now. But honestly, before going into this, I had to shed a lot of negativity, because I noticed I was already going in for the throat. You know what I mean? And I don't want to be that kind of reviewer that purposely reads a book just so I can thrash it. I want to be more open-minded than that. So that's what I tried to do. I just shed all that shit, and I went in with, trying to be, open-minded and willing to just read the story and accept it for what it is, right? Put all the other bullshit beside. She did an amazing job here, guys. This isn't a debut novel. It kick ass. I will say, as far as my criticisms, yes, this book is very formulaic. Like I was saying earlier, especially that first part, there's a lot of this story that just reminds me of other stories. But where the thing, I'm just not that mad at her for it, because she chose great formulas. She chose great tried and true like paths is what she chose, and it shows and it paid off. Because yes, this might not have been the most original story, but it certainly was engaging. It brought me in. Who cares if it's like all those other books? It certainly has enough of its own to stand apart. I want to talk about something I feel that R.F. Kuang did amazing in this book, and that is just like her inclusion of drugs in the world and its effects on its people. This was well done, and it really rings true with how drugs affect our society here today, or even back then. Just like, it's a very realistic take on drugs and addiction. It's one of the things that I noticed right out the gate. It's in that early part. It's part of what made that YA feel a little more adult and not so kiddie in the beginning, was because this is a country that's not only torn by war, but also drug addiction. And then the speech of how to break down a man through opium addiction is very accurate and like on point. As well as the thing I want to mention as well is she just doesn't highlight that it's bad and it's destructive. She also highlights why people would take this stuff, because it might be confusing to some where you're like, well, if it's going to ruin your life, why would you even touch it? Well, because it has amazing painkiller effects. And I'm not really just talking about physical pain. I'm really talking about mental pain. These kinds of substances will just diminish all that pain for you, and that's why people get stuck on this stuff. And she highlights that though as well. She highlights the painkiller aspects as well as just the addiction and the destruction that it can do. All around, she handled this element, this subject, better than I've seen probably anybody else do. I loved it. Now I want to talk about the tone, and honestly, that might be why most of you are here. It's for that one reason. And how I feel about this book, its tone, its introduction amongst grimdark books, all that jazz. Look, guys, I know I'm probably coming off as quite the grimdark snob or whatever. It's just, no, I mean, I have my own opinions. I have my stance on grimdark. That's it. So when it comes to the Poppy War, it's not a grimdark book, in my opinion. I mean, that's mine, and I know that there's so many people watching going, what? How can it be? It's so dark. And I'm like, well, that one chapter is amazingly dark and disturbing, and maybe more dark and disturbing than, what entire grimdark books contain. But it's not really just about, this dark and disturbing stuff, guys. I don't feel like grimdark is its elements as much as it is its tone and its vibe and its delivery. So, why I don't really see this as a grimdark book, one reason being that beginning. Now, people will probably get mad again. What? Well, because I don't feel like coming of age stories really belong in grimdark. I'm not saying you can't do it, but the way it's done in here is not the way it would be done in a grimdark book. It's just not. I mean, honestly, if this was a grimdark book, I don't even think that Rin would ever even have been allowed to study for the test, because her foster mom would have just been like, no, you ain't fucking studying. Done. You know what I mean? It's people are much more cruel, I feel like, in grimdark books. It's a war-torn country. You have addiction. You have darkness and, throughout. But guys, what I'm trying to say as well is, most of this stuff is implied. Most of the death, the destruction, the really crazy shit is implied from beginning to end. There is one or two chapters where it's just ruthless, but the rest and the majority is, like I said, it's lightly touched stuff or it's implied. And this is not a bad thing, because honestly, if you go in depth on everything in this book, I mean, there'd probably be a lot of people that don't want to read it. It'd just be too much. So probably wise decisions to make some implications here instead of going full throttle. But that's what grimdark to me is about. It's about being unforgiving. It's not really being like, oh, I'm sorry, sorry guys. No, it's just like, here's the blood and gore and the guts and all that shit. You know what I mean? As well, it's just so the YA thing, and the implication of the majority of the death destruction for me is just not really inherently grimdark. It's not a bad thing for this book to not be grimdark. Obviously, I feel like it's much more of a praise to say this is like a historical fantasy with like crazy accurate like elements to it. And if you're still kind of mad at me about not thinking that this book is grimdark, I was kind of curious and I looked up an interview with the author where she said herself that she's kind of steering away from calling it grimdark because what that does is take away from the historical accuracy of what she put in this book. And another thing she said is all the stuff that's dark and disturbing in this book is stuff that she pulled from the history books, guys. So it's not stuff that she's just like, oh, I'm going to make it really fucked up. No, not at all. Like she's bringing things out of our world and putting them into the fantasy. And I feel like that guy said that to me, this is a fantasy war story. It's a historical fantasy war story, not a grimdark book. And that's not a bad thing. So when it comes to this challenge that I just kind of created for myself, I don't know if it's really answered or not. I mean, personally, I prefer Beyond Redemption over the Poppy War, just as like book to book. But at the same time, guys, I just don't think that they're in the same genre. I do think that the Poppy War rides the line of grimdark probably more than any other book I've ever read. But it just seems weird to make the comparison between those two books because they just seem very, very, very different in tone and scope, everything. I don't know. It's like comparing apples and oranges, I guess, guys. Now, as far as my 2 cents for the slow and the struggling, I would say that this book is right up your guys' alley as long as you're looking for something like, a fantasy war story that will hit on very brutal elements of warfare. If that sounds like something you would like to get into, by all means, you guys will be able to smash this book out. I was very impressed with R.F. Kuang's writing just because it was easy to digest, straight to the point, but then it also got descriptive when it needed to. It created such a great pace. I didn't see any real like hang-ups for people reading. This is like a great recommendation for people that are in the slow and struggling category and beyond. All right, guys, as always, thanks for spending some time down here at the channel. To R.F. Kuang, bam! Big old thumbs up. This was a great debut novel. There was actually several things that you extremely impressed me on. I might not be, screaming about this book like everybody else, but I was certainly impressed because maybe I wasn't, I didn't have my hopes set that high, but I feel like this was like you should have listened. Yeah. All right, guys, I got to get out of here. All right. If you're new, please like and subscribe. As always, peace.